Chapter 4. Dusty Echoes. A few weeks later, she was still working in the archive. That afternoon, it was colder than usual. Rose had the sense that the damp was creeping under her cuffs, even though she had been down there only a quarter of an hour. She liked these hours. Victor treated her normally. They talked often, and a strange thread of understanding had formed between them. A few times they had even held animated conversations in the corridors, a gesture no one apart from Caroline had dared towards her for a long time.
Now he was pushing the trolley loaded with boxes while she stood on the ladder reaching for those from the top shelves.
"Careful," he said mildly when one of the boxes slid forward too fast. "The ones from the 70s have a habit of falling on people who are in a hurry." "Like everything in this school," she muttered, adjusting her grip. "The older it is, the more vindictive."
She climbed down and set the box carefully on the trolley. Dust burst up into the air like a cloud of tiny insects. For a while they worked in silence. He arranged the boxes in order, she copied catalog numbers onto fresh labels. The rustle of paper, the scrape of the wheels over the uneven floor, the low murmur of the pipes. The archive had its own rhythm, and it was easy enough to fall into step with it.
"The chapel's worse," Victor said suddenly, lightly.
"The chapel?" "Apparently," he added, a touch of irony in his voice, "it has its favorite victims. When we were younger, Matt liked hiding there, especially from his father."
The name dropped between them heavier than the boxes. Rose set her pen down.
"Hiding?" she repeated. "As in literally?"
"Literally," Victor nodded. "There was this one evening, his father turned up unannounced, one of those inspection visits, checking marks, meetings with the headmaster, remarks about conduct worthy of the name."
Rose did not have to imagine that tone. She had heard it in her own mother's letters, only in a different vocabulary.
"Matt knew he was in for it," Victor went on. "I don't even remember whether it was about his grades or something on the pitch. Anyway, he vanished before Whitby Sr. made it to the dorm." He gave a brief smile. "They thought he'd slipped out through the gates."
"And he hadn't," Rose said.
"No, he'd only slipped across one wing." Victor glanced up in the direction where, somewhere above the archive, the chapel must be. He'd wedged himself in behind the altar, in that narrow gap between the wood and the wall, the place even the groundsmen don't look in case they disturb something holy.
Rose pictured Matt crammed into the shadow behind the altar, school blazer and all, like a child hiding in a forbidden attic.
"How do you know?" she asked.
"Because that's where I found him." Victor shrugged. He must have been about 14. He was shaking as if it were 10 below zero, though it was only cool in there. His smile turned thin. He said if he died there, at least it would make the funeral easier. Rose did not answer. It sounded like a joke, but she could hear the same weariness in it that had colored his voice in the tragedy lesson.
"You stayed with him?" she asked at last.
"Yes." Victor reached for another box. "His father searched the whole school. The head sent me to check the perimeter because we've known each other since we were children and because Ashby always does what's required." He quoted in a tone Rose recognized far too well. "I found Matt in the chapel and said I'd tell them he was nowhere on site, that he must have gone off campus."
"And they believed you?" Rose raised her eyebrows.
"They wanted to," Victor said, setting the box on the trolley. "It's easier to pretend your son has slipped beyond the walls for a moment than that he's sitting 50 meters away, shaking because he's terrified of you."
Rose leaned her hip against the table. Victor rarely spoke this long about anything personal. Usually his sentences were as short as the labels on the boxes.
"Why are you telling me this?" she asked.
He thought about it. "Because I think you only see one version of Matt Whitby," he said calmly. "The one with the lighter at the back of the class with his name on the board.
He looked at her steadily. "And I remember the one who sat behind the altar and asked whether, if he ran away from school, the family name would run with him."
The archive seemed to grow quieter, though nothing in it had changed. The same shelves, the same dust, the same dates on the boxes.
Rose looked away towards the 1974 carton, waiting its turn.
"We're all running here," she said, "just in different directions."
Victor did not disagree.
"Maybe." He took her pen to jot down a number on the label. "It's just that some people have an army behind them, who are chasing them with the family crest."
He handed the pen back.
"That's not an excuse," he added, "but it is context." They returned to work. The 70s boxes slid from shelves to trolley, from trolley to table. Rose's hands moved automatically, but the picture of Matt behind the altar refused to dissolve. For the first time, she wondered whether his hatred of her came only from the report and the surname, or whether, when he looked at her, he also saw someone unafraid of a system that had once tried to break him.
And that, at St. Oswald's, was an unforgivable provocation.
The next day they went lower than usual. Professor Llewellyn, tossing them a simple task, pointed to the back row of shelves, the ones pressed closest to the raw, damp wall. "The 70s, she said. "Shift anything that's starting to rot." Rose slid the first box off the shelf. The 1972 carton felt soft to the touch, its corners chewed away by damp. She set it on the trolley and wiped her hands on her skirt. Victor was reaching for the shelf above.
73? He stacked one box. 74. 75. He broke off. This time they heard a different sound, not the dull thud of cardboard, but a short, brittle crack.
"What is it?" she asked, looking up.
Victor did not answer at once. He stood very still, his hand resting on a box at head height. Only now did she see that it was different, darker, heavier, and its lid was not fixed with tape, but bisected by a thick line of old, darkened wax. In the center, a seal had been pressed into it. The impression was blurred and hollowed, the surface polished by the fingers of whoever had handled it too often.
Victor snatched his hand back as if he had burned it.
76, he said quietly. Rose jumped down from the lower rung of the ladder and came closer.
Sealed? She raised her brows. Seriously? Some things like to pretend they're more important than they are, he said, but his voice was too dry for it to be a joke.
She reached out to touch the wax. It was uneven, cracked, but still hard. For a ridiculous moment she had the feeling something shifted beneath it.
"Let's open it," she said. "If we're meant to rescue anything that's deteriorating, then—"
"No." Victor caught her wrist before she could finish.
He did not grip hard, but his fingers were icy. Rose stared at him, startled. It was the first time she had seen anything in him that could be called fear, not caution.
"It's just a box," she said. "Cardboard and paper. No curses."
"My father worked here in 76, he said, looking past her. "In the archive, part-time. He was our age. He says that was the year St. Oswald stopped being a school and turned into a mausoleum."
The word hung in the cold air of the archive, heavier than the date on the label.
"A mausoleum?" Rose repeated. "There's nothing about that in the school histories."
The histories only contain what someone allowed to be written down. Victor lifted one shoulder. The rest gets pushed deeper or drowned in wax.
"What happened?" she asked.
He fell silent.
For a while the only sound was the distant clank of the heating and the faint buzz of the lamp over the table.
"My father doesn't say much," he answered at last. "Just that after that year a few surnames stopped appearing on the alumni lists, and a few others stopped existing in the papers at all."
"Why?" she asked, feeling curious. Curiosity scratch under her skin like an illness.
Because someone needed it that way. He did not try to make light of it this time. He looked at her.
"St. Oswald's keeps very good track of who opens which doors." His hand tightened on the trolley's handle until his knuckles paled. "Some things you leave closed for your own peace of mind, or someone else's."
Rose had the sense that last sentence did not belong to him at all, but to his father, to the generation that had learned to live with knowledge pushed into the cellar.
"Peace of mind isn't what I came here for," she said, lifting a shoulder. "What about you?"
For a moment he looked as though he might answer. Instead, he sighed quietly.
"I've got family history down here," he said. "You've got ambition. We both have reasons not to open that box."
Rose did not agree, but in the end she nodded. For now they left it sealed. They only moved it lower onto the shelf at table height, closer to hand, but still beyond the reach of a choice. The cardboard scraped against the metal with a dull, unpleasant sound. As she climbed back onto the ladder, Rose kept hearing that sound over and over in her head. 1976, shouted from the label, louder than any other year, all the more tempting for how desperately it had been hidden.
The archive, which until now had been only a storeroom of other people's mistakes, began to look like a place where someone had very deliberately locked a story away.
The senior common room was thicker with thoughts than smoke that evening. Someone had lit a fire in the grate, but the flames barely pierced the layer of soot that had built up on the glass over the years. The lamps gave off a yellow, uneven light. The sofas were pilled, the coffee tables scratched, the playing cards long since dulled at the edges.
Rose sat in an armchair by the window, a book open on her lap. The text blurred, the letters ran together in gray lines. She was not reading. In her head there was only one word, mausoleum, and the 1976 box sitting now on its shelf in the archive, pretending to be like all the others.
By the fireplace, a group had settled in for cards. Caroline perched sideways on a sofa arm, one leg dangling, the other braced on the cushion. Waving a fan of cards, she commented on every hand as if the stakes were nothing less than the future of the monarchy rather than a few pounds and the last of the smuggled wine.
"Victor, if you fold on a hand like that again, I'll write coward on your report card myself," she announced, flicking a jack of spades in his direction.
Victor, on her left, kept his cards lined neatly in front of him. He smiled faintly.
"Caution is a very underrated strategy," he said. "It's how people survive." Opposite him, sprawled in an armchair, sat Matt. He held his cards in one hand, the other resting on the armrest, playing with his lighter. The flame flared and died, reflected in the empty glasses on the table.
"Survival's overrated," he muttered. "Winning isn't."
Caroline rolled her eyes. "You'd bet your own birth certificate if someone shuffled the deck nicely enough," she said.
Laughter rippled along the sofa. Rose glanced up from her book. She wasn't looking for anyone in particular, yet she found Victor first. At that exact moment, he looked her way. He inclined his head, brief, the kind of nod you gave someone with whom you shared a catalog, not a social circle.
She answered in kind. It was enough for Caroline to turn.
"Rose!" she called, as if only just noticing her, though Rose had been there at least half an hour. "Come over. Someone here has to know how to play by the rules."
"We are playing by the rules," Matt said under his breath. "The ones we wrote for ourselves." He didn't lift his eyes from his cards, but Rose still had the sense of his gaze on her through the noise.
"I'm not playing," she replied calmly. "I need to finish this reading."
"Of course you do," Caroline snorted. "Books don't read themselves, not even here."
The game went on. Cards hit the table with dry slaps. Chips slid more in one direction than the other. Snatches of sentences reached Rose, tangling in her mind with the image of the wax seal.
"Some things you leave closed for your own peace." After that year, a few names disappeared. Mausoleum.
At one point, Caroline laughed so loudly that a few younger pupils at the far end of the room stared.
"I don't believe it," she shouted. "Matt Whitby just lost a hand because he forgot how many spades he had. Mr. Family Legacy, is your memory worse than Victor's?"
"My memory is selective," Matt said lazily. "It discards anything irrelevant, like your commentary."
"Shame some things don't get thrown out of the files as easily," one of the boys muttered. Rose wasn't sure whether that was aimed at Matt or at her, and she had no intention of finding out. She kept her head down.
The round ended a few minutes later. Carolyn went off to fetch another bottle of juice. A couple of boys drifted over to the magazine shelves. Victor stayed, gathering the cards back into a tidy deck. Matt rose, stretching with deliberate languor.
As they passed her corner, Ashby paused.
"Horace?" he asked quietly, glancing at the cover. "Anything else wouldn't count," she said. "I have to be consistent in my martyrdom."
The corner of his mouth twitched.
"Martyrs usually end up in hagiographies, not archives," he said. "But I'll admit your consistency is impressive."
He leaned a little closer, so the others heard only his tone, not his words.
"The box is still where we left it," he murmured, sounding faintly surprised. "And it's still locked."
"I know," she answered, not raising her voice. "The problem is, so is my curiosity."
"I was sure you'd break into the basement at night just to open it," he said, lifting an eyebrow.
He straightened and gave her a look. His words were neutral, but in his eyes she caught the same flicker she had seen in the archive, fear that had nothing to do with cardboard. Only now there were other things mixed in, and she could not name them. It sounded less like a warning and more like testing how far she was willing to go.
Matt passed them a second later. He stopped just long enough to look at Victor, then at Rose, then back at Victor.
"New discussion club?" he asked. "Anonymous catalog enthusiasts?"
"Relax, Whitby," Rose answered before Victor could. "We're not about to steal your title as the main event."
Matt raised his eyebrows. "And here I was thinking I'd become the main item on your agenda," he said lightly. "That would at least be justified."
"Hardly," she said. "In this school, you're just background, Whitby. Everyone knows you're there, but no one writes a separate note for you."
For a heartbeat, he looked at her with unmasked attention. Then he smiled, briefly, without the slightest echo in his eyes.
"Careful, Hartley," he said as he moved on. "Spend too much time with archivists, and you start seeing things other people would rather leave in their boxes."
By the time he walked away, Caroline was back with the bottle in hand.
"What were you and Victor talking about?" she asked at once, intrigued.
Rose closed the book around her finger, marking the page she hadn't really been reading.
"Nothing," she said.
paper and wax.
Caroline pulled a face.
So, boredom, she concluded. Good thing someone in this school actually has a life.
Rose smiled faintly, but her thoughts were already back underground, at the shelf labeled 1976. In all the noise of the common room, it was the silent box that seemed to be making the loudest noise.